Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Great to see so many of you filtering in. We'll just get started in a moment or so. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this VCMI webinar on a confident carbon market business perspectives. My name is Nina Foster and I'm Communications Manager at VCMI, and I'm very pleased to be your host for today's session and moderator of the panel discussion later on. We published our market research last week and we're very encouraged by the positive response so far. And in this session, we're hoping to unpack the findings in a little bit more detail through a presentation of the key findings, as well as an expert discussion from our core partners across the ecosystem. Just a couple of housekeeping points as we get started. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the webinar. We will have some time at the end of the panel to put a few of your questions to our panelists. So before we come to that important panel discussion, we're going to begin with an overview of the key findings from the report. And for that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Raffaella Infanti, Engagement Manager at VCMI, who led the research and is going to give a brief presentation. Over to you, Rafi.
Thank you very much, Nina, and really welcome everyone. I'm very pleased today to share with you some of the key findings from our research and really look forward to the discussion in the panel right after. So although carbon markets play a critical role for climate action, I'm sure most of you know that business participation has stalled at the time when increased flows of climate finance are really urgently needed. And our new research highlights the business perspectives on what is needed. So what are companies asking for to restore confidence and stimulate growth in the market? VCMI commissioned Accenture to deliver a qualitative and in-depth research study. We were also supported by ICC and WBCSD for the outreach to companies, and we were able to engage with more than 65 businesses through focus group discussions, 20 experts through bilateral interviews, and the analysis of 60 market reports to explore perceptions, barriers, and also the opportunities in carbon market participation. Across the board, the key message that I'm highlighting here is that businesses identified that clear, aligned, and stable rules on how and when to use carbon credits are the critical lever to scale engagement in high-integrity carbon markets. If we look at the opportunities, businesses see carbon markets as a critical element of meeting their climate and sustainability goals. They identified as number one, as top opportunity, making progress towards climate goals. Second, demonstrating action across broader nature and social goals is the second largest opportunity, according to companies, with some of them claiming that it is their main reason for participation, indicating the importance of clarity and transparency on how emission reduction projects also deliver these nature and social benefits. While enhancing brand reputation emerges as the second most cited opportunity in the literature review, we see a shift in business sentiment. And so companies now rank it as the least important, highlighting, as I mentioned, a shift in this business sentiment towards the use of carbon credits versus what we have seen in the past. If we move on to the into the barriers, we see that reputational concerns recently, coupled with poor carbon credit quality and inconsistency across regulatory and voluntary frameworks, have made companies cautious about participation. Businesses now associate carbon markets with reputational risks, with the concerns about carbon credit quality, transparency, and integrity being rated as the top barrier. Companies say that poor practice, coupled with media scrutiny and public skepticism, have contributed to a decline in market trust. And in addition to that, unclear and fragmented regulation and voluntary frameworks have been identified as amplifiers. So they do amplify the barriers for companies. There's regulatory ambiguity on one hand and inconsistent voluntary standards that both contribute to confusion and limit the ability of companies to make informed decisions. Many companies express concerns over investing in credits that may, for example, later be considered non-compliant or of insufficient quality. And this uncertainty undermines the confidence and deters companies from making both short-term purchases, but also long-term investments. So what is needed to restore confidence in carbon markets? Businesses say that clear, aligned, and stable rules, whether from regulatory or voluntary frameworks, are really critical to justify larger scale investment into the market. They claim that without clear rules, including also direct requirements, the business case for participation in carbon markets is currently weak. Another solution that was discussed a lot in the focus groups, and in the absence or while clear rules and requirements are coming together, solutions that demonstrate tangible value in the short term are needed. And creating a business case is still viable for certain sectors and regions, although companies admit that the scale of impact will likely be less than if we have these clear rules or requirements in place. How to do that in terms of demonstrating the tangible value and the business case in the absence of these clear rules and requirements? There are a couple of points that companies point to. One is to shift the narrative, to focus more on the financial benefits of market participation. Decision makers are demanding clear justifications for investment in carbon credits as they anticipate reputational risks when participating in carbon markets, and as sustainability-related investments are also increasingly embedded into the business planning. And second, nature and social benefits. These can also enhance the value case for carbon credits, offering these measurable outcomes that go beyond carbon and that help companies demonstrate impact when they might not have a financial business case at hand. In addition to that, other solutions that companies brainstormed on and we discussed during the focus groups were about third-party endorsements and peer influence as important components that also matter. Companies say that endorsements of the use of carbon credits, for example, from governments or from NGOs or scientific bodies, really help validate market participation and reduce the reputational risk that companies perceive in investing. Along these lines, also, action by peers is said to be encouraging broader engagement by setting, for example, industry precedents and also by sharing of risks and resources. Finally, although not mentioned as a top need for change, businesses still say that the credit quality is a top concern for them. And so availability and assurance of quality credits is still needed. Companies ask for more clarity, for example, on routes to procurement of quality credits and market services that can help limit risk around quality, such as, for example, carbon rating agencies. And finally, companies recommended a range of other solutions to support the market, such as, for example, internal upskilling, in terms of supporting the company internally in building the case, in communicating the tangible value to the C-suite to get investment, or, for example, financial incentives. This wraps up my very brief presentation for today. There will be time in the panel discussion now to go through some of these key highlights and hopefully unpack some of those with our guests. So thank you very much for listening, and I will now pass it back to Nina, who will introduce the panel discussion. Thank you, and over to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Rafaela, for that very clear and compelling overview of the research findings. We're now going to move on to our panel discussion. So very soon you'll start to see the faces of our panelists pop up on screen alongside me soon. For this discussion, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by distinguished experts on the topics of corporate sustainability and carbon markets. We're joined by Mark Kenber, Executive Director of VCMI, who holds 3 decades of experience across market-based instruments for environmental protection, with a particular focus on carbon markets. Raylene Martin, Head of Sustainability at the ICC. Raylene has 16 years of experience at the ICC, the world's largest business organization representing more than 45 million companies in 100 countries. And John Williams, who wears a number of hats at Accenture as Global Financial Services Lead and also UK, Ireland and Africa Sustainability Services Lead. We should also be joined shortly by Dominic from WBCSD. We're just having some slight technical difficulties getting him on board, but we will kick off the panel discussion and hopefully get him on board soon. So 1 second, I will just stop sharing my screen and get into the discussion. So thank you all so much for joining this very important discussion. Obviously, VCMI commissioned this research because we want to understand what businesses need to restore confidence in carbon markets. Mark, it would be great to start with you to understand why this is an important goal. Could you set out the potential of a confident carbon market from a climate mitigation and finance perspective?
Yes, thank you, Nina. I'd be happy to. So I think first to sort of cut through some of the debate, there are those who believe that carbon markets and markets in general have no role in climate policy. And then others at the other extreme who think that carbon markets will solve all the climate problems and perhaps other world problems as well. And both of those are unrealistic. We have an annual climate finance gap at the moment at 1.3 trillion. That was last year's number, so it's undoubtedly higher now and counting. And carbon markets, in particular the carbon finance that they generate, can play a role both directly in addressing some of that 1.3 trillion, but will always be quite small, but have the added value of being able to leverage other capital, technology, skills, capacity that the countries that are hosting projects will need to be able to have more ambitious nationally determined contributions and green growth development strategies in the future. Carbon markets continue, though, to be an underused tool in the fight against climate change. Supply is greater than demand at the moment. There are sitting on the books of the independent registries, Vera, Gold Standard, etc., nearly 1 billion tons of unretired credits. So there is supply out there. Demand is the challenge at the moment. And if you look at the total value of credits traded last year, just over $500 million, that's about a quarter of the value in 2021. So not only is the market stagnated, it's slowly weakening, despite the fact that there has been considerable amount of investment in pipeline, in market infrastructure, and so on and so forth. We are seeing that buyers are focusing ever more on higher quality and therefore higher price credits, a price premium for core carbon principle labeled credits issued under the aegis of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, and also those credits that have higher ratings from the ratings agencies such as B0, Silvera, Calix, and others. But that's not yet driving the market to scale. So one aspect of a confident carbon market would be one that is really reaching its potential. That's the num. There are lots of numbers that are bandied around, but a sort of broadly accepted estimate is if it reached its potential, it would be between $30 to $50 billion a year by 2030, a significant increase on that, on where we are now. And as I mentioned, they can have this leveraging effect, and some evidence, and I think B0 published, suggested that carbon finance can generate or leverage 7 times as much capital and other benefits. So the carbon finance is a way of unlocking broader capital and finance into projects and activities, particularly in emerging markets and developing economies, that wouldn't go otherwise. So it's not just the carbon finance, it's carbon finance and its multiplier effect. And that's particularly important because it's precisely those countries that are likely to be hosting carbon crediting projects that find it most difficult to attract capital on attractive terms. Cost of capital in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia far greater than what we pay in the US and Europe. And so if carbon finance can help bring down that cost of capital, that makes financing projects and other activities more attractive. And just to finalize, looking at the mitigation side, if you look at the 30 agenda item priorities that the COP30 presidency has laid out for COP30 later this year, carbon markets have a role in delivering many of those. So both mitigation and broader sustainable development goals, such as ensuring access to energy, halting and reversing deforestation, protecting and restoring natural ecosystems, land restoration and sustainable agriculture, and climate and sustainable finance. So this is not to say that a confident carbon market is a panacea to the world's ills, but it can play a significant role in leveraging capital, achieving other social, environmental, and climate goals, and drive more mitigation.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really valuable introduction to the potential at stake here. Raylene, I wanted to come to you. So we've just heard about the potential of a confident carbon market from a climate and a climate finance perspective. What value would a confident carbon market bring to the businesses that ICC represents?
Thank you so much, Nina, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to join today's discussion to provide some perspectives on behalf of ICC. And we're absolutely delighted to partner with VCMI on this important study to mobilize private sector participation to really understand what some of the challenges are to unlocking the potential that's really there, but also looking to potential solutions. And so a huge congratulations to the team for the launch of this report, and thank you for the very helpful summary of the findings. So on behalf of ICC, we really do see that business has quite a vital role to play in delivering the net zero transition, and that confident, well-functioning carbon markets are really quite integral to that effort. And so in our view, we think that carbon markets are not just a nice to have, they really are a strategic enabler of business-led climate action. And firstly, we see carbon markets as being quite a powerful catalyst for innovation and investment. By being able to put a value on emissions reductions, they really can unlock capital for technologies such as carbon capture and nature-based solutions. And so we see this not only about compliance, really see it as market opportunity. And so voluntary markets in particular do let companies go beyond their value chains and take immediate high impact action. And then secondly, one of the other points we'd like to mention is that carbon markets can help accelerate climate ambition. They really help bridge that gap between some of the current capabilities and future targets, really enabling businesses to act now while longer term transitions are still underway. That being said, to be clear, we don't see this as a substitute for deep decarbonization. We really see it as a complement that really enhances accountability and helps to speed progress. And then the next point is really around resilience. And I know earlier, Rafaela highlighted the point about tangible values and where there may be opportunities to recognize some of the co-benefits. And so voluntary carbon markets really can often mobilize financial support for adaptation in communities and ecosystems that are really most at risk, many of which are really quite core to global supply chains. And so supporting resilience in these areas really helps to reduce climate risks for businesses themselves. And then finally, we see the opportunity for a level playing field. And we strongly support many of the efforts that are currently underway to build integrity and transparency in carbon markets. I think through the frameworks that are currently established and guidance within ICVCM, VCMI, the recent conclusion of Article 6, as well as many of the different standards and frameworks that are in place. And for us, those trusted interoperable markets reduce regulatory fragmentation and transaction costs, especially for global businesses that are operating across borders. So essentially, we see that carbon markets can deliver real impact in enabling and unlocking business value and channeling finance where it's most needed. And so at ICC, we really are committed to help shape well-functioning, high-integrity carbon markets, and that we see that there's an opportunity that when those work, they do work for everyone, for businesses, for communities, as well as for the planet. I think those are my initial reflections, but happy to come in later in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Raylene. Really interesting to hear that perspective of how carbon markets could benefit businesses around the world. Moving on now to what this confident carbon market would look like. John, you were closely involved in the research. What did it reveal about what a confident carbon market looks like from a business perspective? And how does that chime with your experience of working directly with corporates on their transition strategies?
No, thanks very much, Nina, and good afternoon to everyone. Really pleased to be here and pleased to have supported VCMI on this research. The Economist to me says that confident markets look something like this. You know the product you're buying. Why? Because there are maybe some standards that define that product. You've got a very clear view as to the supply chains. You've got a clear view of the demand for those products, and you have a price that clears the market. And where needed, pragmatic regulation to support that market. And I don't think carbon markets should be any different. You know, you need to be really clear on the product. So the work that's been done around integrity, you know, through the VCMI and the ICVCM, I think is really critical because that defines what the product is. Clearly, there needs to be a greater supply of you know, those quality credits that have been sort of assured. Again, many other products have assurance around them to say this is the standard that they meet. Mark touched a little bit on the lack of demand, and I'm going to put a bit of positivity into the discussion. We review every year the climate plans of the top 2,000 companies in the world, whether they have a net zero commitment or not. And the good news is 37% of those 2,000 companies, 740 companies, have scope 1, 2, and 3 targets. So they have complete net zero targets. And of those, over 3/4 have a net zero transition plan. And within that, 48% would use carbon removal, 64 carbon offsets, and 50% using carbon pricing. So if I look at that data, that would say to me there is demand to help bridge that gap with supply that Mark was talking about. So why isn't that demand appearing in the market? I think there are a couple of reasons, and Rafi outlined a number of them. I don't want to repeat what she said, but I think having those clear, aligned, and stable rules is critical because if you're going into the market, you want to know what it is you're buying. I think the financial business case is also important. You know, we work at Accenture with sustainability and strategy people, but also risk managers and finance directors. And they'll always say, well, why do I need to do this? Why should I buy this now? You know, for all the reasons that Rafi said, you know, some of the risks around it. And the key thing is the business case. You know, if I invest directly in a carbon credit as opposed to maybe buying one in the market, what value am I creating for the project sponsor? How much of the value do I get? Does it de-risk some of my future carbon emissions? Do I get in at a better price, etc.? So thinking more broadly than just going in and buying something in the market is really, really important. What other co-benefits are there? You know, biodiversity, you know, people co-benefits, and are they monetizable? Or if not, are they just you know, good for some of the broader impacts that we want to create in the market? And I think having that sort of third-party endorsement, so you feel you're in a market with others, is really quite important. So they're my sort of initial observations, but a confident market has known supply, known demand, a clearing price, a known product supported by standards.
Thank you so much, John, and great to have that lived experience of working directly with corporates layered in. Dominic, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very pleased to see you here. I wanted to come to you on a theme that was very strong in the research, which was this shifting business sentiment towards carbon markets over time. What are your reflections on that shifting business sentiment, and what would business attitudes and actions on carbon markets look like in a more confident carbon market?
Thanks, Nina. It's great to be with you, and just to add my kind of appreciation for the work that's been done by VCMI with this report. We're happy to contribute to that here at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's an important piece of work because this is such a key piece of the architecture to tackle the climate crisis that we need, particularly from the business community. The report found that 90% of surveyed businesses say rigorous quality assurance is essential to rebuilding the trust in carbon markets. I think that's quite an important finding because we've certainly seen from WBCSD membership, we have about 250 companies representing $11.5 trillion in corporate revenue, that there has been a dent in the trust and a desire to use markets over the last few years. I think according to Forest Trends Ecosystem Marketplace, carbon credit issuance fell 56% over the last few years. Retirements dropped by nearly 10%. It's this issue of reputational risk and confusion about what constitutes credible use, and the kind of uncertainty about the future, which is the thing to fix. I think it's important to note, and John mentioned this, there are a lot of companies who are using carbon markets previously, a lot of first movers. And then there was a lot of public criticism, particularly in various aspects of the media, which kind of pulled them back. And that's meant that people have stopped buying credits altogether, which has meant, ironically, less mitigation overall. So, these are some particular hurdles to overcome. So it does come down to this enabling environment, I think, that Raylene and Mark were talking about earlier, and how we get to a stage where companies feel supported and not punished or exposed for taking that additional responsibility. And vitally, the value proposition such that credit use can be strategically integrated into climate transition plans. That's a really key one, so that this isn't just seen as a sort of extra thing on top, but it's core to the mitigation strategy of a company, and there's a value proposition for undertaking the credit bit. So in that context, things like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which we co-host with the World Resources Institute, and the update of some of these standards and guidance, together with the upcoming SBTI Net Zero Standard version 2, start to become quite important evolutions in how we can use credits for businesses, not just at net zero, but on the way to net zero. So kind of a confident carbon market and confidence in a carbon market would make companies feel supported, not punished, for taking that additional responsibility. Be able to strategically use credits in climate transition plans, and have things like the ability to use credits as an interim backstop if a company falls off its emissions reduction trajectory for unforeseen reasons, or an ability to use them responsibly for annual residuals, even if you're on track, or preparing for net zero, kind of outside value chain removals to neutralize residuals at net zero, not just at 2049, but all the way before. So these are some of the dimensions, I think, that we can bring in to create confidence in the market. Once we do that, we'll get to where Mark says, because there is a willingness to put that capital in. It's not that the money isn't there, but it's just a confidence that needs to be unlocked to allow it to happen. And all of those multiple benefits that we talk about, particularly in a world where ODA, overseas development assistance, is kind of scaling back a little bit, the critical capital flow we need into emerging and developing countries for this transition is vital. So there are multiple reasons why we need to inject that confidence back into the market, why this report is so hugely important. And I really commend it to everyone who is listening to this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That's extremely helpful. Moving on to what the research found about what businesses actually need to create this kind of confident carbon market. Mark, would you be able to speak to what the research revealed about what businesses need from governments in particular to create a confident carbon market?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think I'll start by saying what companies are looking from whoever is creating the standards, the guidance, or the frameworks that they need to follow, whether that's government or, as Dominic mentioned, SBTI coming up with its revised corporate net zero standard. What companies want, and this is not true just of carbon markets, and I'm sure those who work in other spaces would say the same. They want clarity, stability, and alignment on the rules on how and when they use carbon credits. And that's, what companies want, broadly speaking, I'm sure Raylene would say, in almost every market they operate in. Clarity is on the permitted use of carbon credits within the context of a net zero strategy. And whether that's a corporate transition plan or an SBTI type target, I want to know when and how they can use carbon credits. Alignment means that that's consistent across sectors and across jurisdictions and across regions. And one of the things that companies did say to us is, please, we're already seeing different standards for use of carbon credits, different standards for credits themselves, different rules on what they can be used for, different rules on whether they can be exported or not, and so on and so forth, rules around authorization. We want to have as much consistency and alignment as possible, along with any additional voluntary obligations that go along with that. And then stability was seen as the critical factor by corporates, that they're planning, corporate climate transition plans are plans that can last between 10, 25, 30 years. Planning investments in infrastructure, in technology, in siting of facilities is not something that happens on a year-to-year basis. So if carbon credits are going to be part of a strategic approach, then there needs to be stability over time. We want to know what the rules are likely to be in 2040, not just in 2028 and 2030. So clarity, alignment, and stability. And those could come both from well-respected, well-regarded non-government initiatives. And two obvious ones at the moment are, as Dominic mentioned, the corporate net zero standard that SBTI are developing, but also the net zero standard that ISO is currently developing. And I think both are planning to be launched in the first half of next year. So both of those, if they give clear, aligned and stable guidance on how and when companies can use carbon credits as part of those net zero standards, that will go a long way. However, at the same time, many companies have said either they may not be part of SBTI or ISO, there may be something that's beyond them, or they're in countries where regulation and jurisdiction policy are more important, and therefore an equally good and perhaps even preferable alternative would be policy, incentives, regulation, clarity at the government level where they operate on how they can use carbon credits alongside any compliance obligations they may have. Now, it is that varied from sector to sector. Not all companies said we want more regulation. That will surprise no one on this webinar, that companies aren't necessarily calling for more government intervention. But in several sectors in particular, regulation was seen as key because that was the only way to get the kind of clarity, alignment, and stability that they were asking for. Hard to abate sectors in particular said that regulation was what would provide the relevance and authority for them to act, because the costs are particularly high, the capital investments are high, and that stable regulation and the backing from government and the fact that it could almost become a mandate. And it was interesting that one of the comments that some companies said was, why not just have a direct requirement on companies to buy carbon credits matching a certain portion of their emissions each year? So that wasn't instead of other incentives, but there was a few companies mentioned that, and that was a very direct government approach. However, they also said governments should be pragmatic about this. There's no point setting a kind of a standard or a framework that is either unachievable or that doesn't give enough lead-in time for companies to be able to implement it. So balance climate ambition and implementation feasibility. So, for example, if there is a requirement to buy carbon credits, that should phase up over time, or if there's the ability to use carbon credits to meet a carbon tax liability, for example, as in Colombia, Singapore, Chile, that tax rate should not come in at a ridiculously high rate to start with, but grow over time, and the way that carbon credits can be used to meet that evolve over time as well. So governments can play a big role, in part just by providing the narrative, the air cover that companies need by saying, we believe that carbon credit finance and carbon credit projects are important. But to create that clarity, stability, and alignment, it needs either the frameworks or government themselves to put in place frameworks to do that. And we've just seen, for example, the launch of the Coalition to Grow Carbon Markets, led by Singapore, Kenya, and the United Kingdom, looking precisely to do that over the next 2 to 3 years, to create the right policy framework and incentives so that companies can be confident in engaging with the market.
Thank you, Mark. That was really helpful and interesting to hear about how views on regulation differed amongst sectors, and to hear about the action that governments are now taking. Raylene, I wanted to come to you next, because as well as there being business interest in clarity from governments, they also were interested in clarity from voluntary frameworks. In your experience working with businesses around the world, how influential can these voluntary frameworks be in incentivizing corporate climate action?
Thank you so much, Nina, and thank you, Mark, for the prior remarks. I think my reflections will probably echo some of the points that Mark has already reflected on. And I think as ICC, representing businesses of different sizes and sectors around the world, really hear a very clear message, I think, from our members, that they do want to lead on climate, but they certainly need clarity, consistency, and confidence in the rules of engagement. And so this is exactly where we see voluntary frameworks can play a pivotal role in building a trusted and effective carbon market. In the first instance, they really help to establish that clarity and stability that businesses are looking for. There's still a certain amount of uncertainty around what makes a credit high quality, how to use them credibly, and what responsible climate leadership could look like. And so many of the initiatives, I think, that have also been mentioned in the context of this discussion, and that Mark also alluded to, I think, including the great work being done by ICVCM, VCMI, I think the recent consultation on the SBTI net zero standard, as well as the ISO standard, I think really are starting to shift and make a change in that regard by trying to really set out some of the clear benchmarks and creating a common language for quality use and credibility. And so we really see that as being quite essential in terms of restoring trust and confidence across investors, buyers, and the public. And then we also see that these frameworks in particular can help incentivize action and scale participation. They don't just clarify the rules, but they also lower those barriers to entry and can provide some of the clear guidance on how and when credits can complement decarbonization. They give companies that confidence that's really needed to engage with integrity. And I think another point I'd like to mention, particularly for smaller businesses, is that it could be important for them, for SMEs as well, in emerging markets who often lack some of those resources to navigate rather complex or fragmented landscape. So we also see an opportunity where high integrity voluntary standards can inform some of the national and regional compliance systems over time, and they really can act as a testing ground for innovation, I think, both in MRV and technologies that could later be integrated in some of the jurisdictional frameworks. And so that kind of approach, I think, could be helpful to really build a globally coherent market architecture under Article 6. And then I think my final remark would really be that voluntary frameworks can provide that platform for business leadership, as they really do allow companies to go beyond just compliance, but really demonstrating a high level of ambition, investing in broader mitigation, and also positioning themselves strategically in a decarbonizing world. So there is the issue of reputation, but I think it goes beyond that. And we also need to consider the points around resilience, risk management, as well as long-term value for businesses. So essentially, I think to wrap up my comments, we really do see that there can be much more than just technical tools. They really are confidence building mechanisms that really are quite essential to establishing that trusted high integrity carbon market that we're all calling for. So I'd like to leave it at that, but happy to address any further questions after. Thanks so much, Nina.
Thank you, Raylene. Really interesting to hear those reflections on the role of voluntary frameworks. John, does that match your experience of the impact of voluntary frameworks on the direction of travel that corporates take?
No, most certainly, and I'm going to draw the parallel with the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that I sat on. And if you think about the TCFD, we never were given a mandate to say this will be mandatory. I mean, the Financial Stability Board, who we worked with, have no sort of mandatory powers. They're advisory for the G20 finance ministers. So we always knew we had to write something that was robust but pragmatic. Every time we wrote a word, almost, we said, is it a decision useful recommendation? If not, then get rid of it. And so you end up with a framework. We spoke to 2,000 individual companies over the course of the year that we developed the guidelines, and they were just guidelines. Having the G20 finance ministers endorse them, I think, was really powerful. Having bodies like the ICC and WBCSD promote them to their members, really powerful. But they were voluntary standards. And what happened as you move forward is that some jurisdictions, such as the UK, made TCFD-aligned disclosures mandatory, and so you saw that. You've then seen, the work under CSRD more broadly within the European Union, and then the ISSB has taken those standards, and so that route from voluntary to mandatory, giving people the space to experiment, to practice, to show what they can do, and at the right moment, deciding whether you make something mandatory is really powerful. And I think that collective action with political support, with business support, is really important. When people reverse on some of those direction of travel, as we're seeing perhaps a little bit around sustainability reporting, or people get nervous politically about being part of organizations, you begin to see commitments go backwards. And you've seen across a number of sectors, people saying we're not going to be able to meet our net zero interim targets because we're not seeing the progress we expected, or they're nervous about remaining in sort of collective pre-competitive groups. So I think having that clear direction of travel, showing how the path goes from voluntary to mandatory where it's needed, is really important, but maintaining the journey. You can't travel towards the precipice we're heading for and zigzag all over the place. You might just go off the end of it if you're not careful. And my experience of working within Accenture and our own net zero commitment and the carbon offset projects that we invest directly in and working with clients is, if we have some clear rules and if we understand what it is that we are investing in, and we're seeing some clear benefits, then we're likely to move forward. And there was a question in the chat around what are some of the financial benefits. So I think a couple of examples, long-term power purchase agreements, where you don't really understand a carbon price over, say, 10 years, investing now in carbon credit projects where you may get in a better value. You may create value for you and the project developer in that project, but also give yourself a hedge against future carbon costs on long-term contracts. And another project I particularly like is Latin America, where in the drinks industry there's been reforestation, partly because of the carbon benefit, but mainly because of the watershed protection and the water quality that goes into a drinks plant. So again, good biodiversity and carbon co-benefits from sensible, financially based business decisions.
Right, so a range of connected benefits for businesses there in engagement. Thanks very much, John. Dominic, coming to you, as well as clearer rules from government or from voluntary frameworks, one thing that businesses highlighted that they needed in the research was an environment that endorses and encourages carbon market engagement. How important is that kind of endorsement in your experience, and who does that endorsement need to come from to be impactful?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. It's an interesting one, but incredibly important. So there's an effort about restoring confidence, not just in like the technical credits themselves, but in the kind of scaffolding and in the architecture, what we call the enabling environment that surrounds it. So for those of you who are listening, you check out the report because there's a number of solutions on this area. I'm going to kind of touch on 2 or 3 of them, but just as examples to what you're mentioning, Nina. So for example, a recommendation to continue improving the quality of credits and their availability. Okay. So first and foremost, companies want to know, have assurance that those credits are real, additional, and aligned with science. In fact, the report says that 70% of firms prioritize transparent credit frameworks aligned with science-based standards. That means the quality is non-negotiable because a company's credibility is linked to the climate impact of the credit it buys, which means then the enabling environment for things like the ICVCM core carbon principles play a key role. So it's not just the kind of credits themselves, it's like a piece of the architecture like the ICVCM to bring in clarity and rigor. But as well as that piece, the supply side also matters. So in this kind of enabling environment, companies not going to make a public commitment unless they're confident that there's the right kind of credit at the right kind of volume, which means another piece of the enabling environment, which was mentioned in the report, these collective action mechanisms. So things like buyers clubs and coalitions, which can create shared confidence and reduce exposure for any one individual company. The LEAF coalition is a pretty good example of that. It catalyzed demand for jurisdictional RED plus and proves that pre-commitments can unlock supplies. So we need kind of these sorts of pieces of the jigsaw to kind of work together, as well as just a technical analysis around the credit. The Symbiosis Coalition is doing the same for nature-based removals, and that signals early demand to a still emerging segment of the market. So again, very important piece of the enabling environment. And then another kind of underestimated one, but the report picks out quite well, is endorsement by trusted actors, which is quite central. So if you're kind of engaging in carbon credits as a business, you want to know that your actions are recognized and supported by reputable institutions. So a good example of that is, it's a little bit closer to home, but at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, together with some other actors, we built the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder coalition with a large number of businesses, but also major NGOs like the Nature Conservation and the Nature Conservancy, the World Resources Institute, Conservation International. And that kind of helps to ensure the high integrity of the supply side, what good looks like in your portfolio to buy, and provides a kind of clearinghouse for those sorts of discussions. So as well as the credit themselves, these kinds of pieces of the jigsaw are super important. And it's really good that the report, in my opinion at least, picks out these things, because unless we work on all aspects of the confidence build, including that enabling environment, we're not going to get to the scale that we want. And sometimes it can feel quite complicated for the business side, like there's all these multiple organizations and, all these different acronyms and things. So our job, is to kind of make that pretty friction free. So as you work through these different institutions, they're using the same kind of language. Oh, I understand what that one does, what this one does, how that works. We can actually create a very frictionless approach to getting to scale. And that's kind of on us in the space. And the report, I think, picks out that pretty well as an important aspect to work on too. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we've had fascinating questions coming in, and I want to leave some time for our panelists to dig into those. Before we do that, I just want to hear some short final reflections from each of you. Now, we've talked a lot about confidence from businesses, but I want to ask each of you how confident you are that the clear needs that businesses highlighted will be implemented as we move forward. So, Mark, why don't we start with you? How confident are you feeling?
Thank you. I'm fairly confident. I think there are reasons to be confident, but also reasons to be cautious. On the confidence side, companies clearly said that they want these clear, stable, and aligned frameworks. We've seen, I don't know what's going on inside the black box that is ISO, but from SBTI, their recent consultation draft and conversation, what we're hearing, they seem to be more open to companies using market-based instruments as part of their corporate transitions. On the government side, we've had the UK has just consulted on its principles for high integrity carbon markets and looking at what it will do practically to reinforce that. Singapore has got out a document for consultation on how corporates can use carbon credits. You have the French government's carbon credit charter. So more and more governments are looking at this. There was a question in the in the Q&A about the Green Claims Directive. Clearly, a group of 27 governments looking at how they can provide clear guidance on how what claims companies can make and how those involve carbon credits. So it seems that governments and the voluntary frameworks are stepping up, are recognizing that, notwithstanding the points that John made about how many companies have climate transition plans, that we are still way off track in terms of emissions reductions, and that companies clearly say that in some cases, either to smooth the journey or to bridge the gap from where they are to where they should be, carbon credits used well can play a big role. And I think that's becoming increasingly recognized. So I'm confident in that sense. Cautious because we've been having variants of this conversation for 25 odd years. I've been involved in carbon credit markets for at least that long. And we're kind of always hoping for that moment. So, while I see the green shoots, who knows whether they'll grow or not. I think there is also an issue around the scrutiny of carbon credits, and that scrutiny that's happened over the last 2 to 3 years, which has driven a lot of the integrity agenda, is really important because we can't afford to have lousy projects that are not real additional permanents, etc. But we also need to recognize that not every project and every credit will always be perfect. That's why ratings agencies rate things. If they were all perfect, they wouldn't have a job to do. So we just need to make sure that every time there is something there's a slip up, we don't throw everything out and feel like we have to start all over again. And that makes me cautious. And then finally, there's still confusion about what proponents of high integrity carbon markets are calling for. And from a VCMI perspective, it's a yes and. It's not instead of decarbonisation, it's part of. And I think that's why, Dominic's framing of corporate climate transition plans rather than just the targets. Corporate climate transition plans will have decarbonisation, they'll have R&D, they'll have market research, they'll have engagement with suppliers and with customers, and they'll also use market-based instruments, including carbon credits. And when you look at it in that way, then I think it's much clearer what we're looking for.
Thanks so much. Raylene, what about you? How are your confidence levels?
Thank you so much, Nina. I must admit, I'm generally an optimist at heart, but appreciate Mark's comments about sometimes needing some cautious optimism, and particularly where we're seeing signals where there's need for improvement. But I think more broadly from ICC, we've certainly very much welcomed the growing momentum that we're seeing to strengthen confidence in the market. And I think as the market research study has identified, there's really clear needs from the business community that range from greater clarity and consistency on the use of credits, whether regulatory or voluntary, and enhanced trust and transparency in carbon credit quality, as well as that need for a clear business case to engage and recognized benefits for the value case. So in our view, we've been really encouraged to see some positive steps in that direction, where we are seeing a growing recognition of that need and how to really unlock that demand for private sector engagement. So that includes, I think, some of the points that Mark has very clearly highlighted around governments looking to introduce principles to support credible market participation. And then, of course, some of the other industry areas, including SBTI and ISO, really provide that valuable opportunity for businesses to inform the development of international standards that are really quite a positive step in that direction. So whilst we recognize that implementation is still very much a work in progress, we're quite confident that this convergence, I think, of public and private sector efforts will really help ensure that the right conditions are in place to scale voluntary carbon markets with integrity and with impact. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Raylene. What a positive message. John, how are you feeling? How confident are you?
Yeah, look, I'm reasonably confident. A little bit like Raylene, I'm an eternal optimist. Having bought my first carbon credit 20 years ago, I probably should continue to be optimistic. So I think all the building blocks are there. Yesterday, the SBTI released its financial institutions net zero standard, so it brings in the sort of financial markets more closely. If I've got one caution, I worry that science is telling us one thing, and political leadership is slightly diverging. We don't have too many years to fix this, and if I was a politician, I would have wanted to listen to the warnings from, I think it was the Financial Stability Board last week, which is talking about a 5% hit to GDP, if we don't actually move in the next 5 years on decarbonisation. So, that's a big hit. And if you're a politician, GDP growth is the one thing that gets you out of trouble.
Thanks so much. And Dominic, I'm going to ask you the same question. I'm going to layer in another question as well from the audience. So we had a really interesting question about what the current business case is for carbon market participation, and how you see that evolving over the coming years. Could you talk about your own confidence levels as well as that business case?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of confidence, this reference may or may not chime with those listening, but to quote the famous Ian Jury, I have reasons to be cheerful. I think we've seen some good movements in the discussion, both in some of the areas like ISO and SBTI in terms of the net zero guidance, which is being looked at. It's a bit different from a couple of years ago, I would say. I was really quite excited by the announcement from Singapore and UK on the kind of coalition to grow carbon markets, and the idea of high integrity government-backed kind of markets as a club, Kenya being in there, and some other jurisdictions might join, and particularly with the role of the World Bank to provide sorts of concessional finance and other sorts of instruments. These aren't things that were in the mix kind of 2 or 3 years ago, and I do think that those aspects will only grow. If I look, in our areas of activity, what Singapore is leading on and kind of ASEAN is super important, and think a couple of years ahead with Singapore's presidency of ASEAN coming up. There's some potentially really good developments taking place and in the pipeline. So I have reasons to be cheerful about those pieces of the jigsaw. Right now, the challenge is like anything, it's to kind of rebuild a little bit of confidence. I think initiatives like VCMI's Claims Code, ICVCM's Core Carbon Principles are really, really helpful in driving supply-demand convergence. I do think that we really need to be able to help those who have the money on the balance sheet and not in discretionary formats like foundations, to be able to feel confident that there is a value proposition related to core carbon accounting that I can invest in carbon credits. That's the thing that's going to have to change. And I think the update in some of those net zero guidances, I think the work that we do in some areas related to technical inputs to looking at greenhouse gas protocol standards as well as the SBTI are going to be critical. Where I think that business case is going to come from is a combination of all of those things. 22 years ago, there was no greenhouse gas protocol, and there wasn't a kind of global decision to make one. It came from BP, General Motors, and Dow Chemical, who said it's a really, really complicated process. And it's a bit of a kind of Wild West out there in terms of how people are trying to account for their greenhouse gas emissions. Hey, World Resources Institute, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, could you look at what we are doing and try to make it better as an approach for organizing how we account for greenhouse gas emissions? That became Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. And that is not a de jure, but it's a de facto common mechanism around the world, which some jurisdictions have taken on. That is because a group of people from NGO community, from business and other positions of leadership and responsibility came together to have a high bar on what good looked like to organize a process. And I think the same thing is true here. I hope if there's any kind of colleagues from the media who are engaged in this particular website, that you would particularly want to lean in and ask a couple of questions about that. Because if we're going to fix this challenge by 2030, it is absolutely clear that high integrity, good quality credit markets are going to have to play a role. And if you are deciding to kind of underwrite that, that doesn't really help in terms of where we're all trying to get to. So I would lean in and ask some pretty kind of engaged questions about, how do we get to good, not black or white, yes or no, because that doesn't help anybody. And in my opinion, I want to commend again the work of VCMI and others in that report. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you so much. Thank you. What a positive note to end on. That is all we have time for. Thank you all so much for joining us for this discussion, and especially to our panelists for amazing insights. I really enjoyed that discussion and learned a lot myself. Thanks for joining us. There are links in the chat to the report, ways to stay up to date with what we are doing as VCMI, and we'll be sharing a recording of the webinar in the coming days. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at VCMI. Again, contact details are in the chat. So thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world. And thanks again to our amazing panelists. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.